Hello and welcome back to Rev Real Estate School. I'm your host, Michael Montgomery, and today we're talking about scripts that you can use with sellers in a shifting market. So when it comes to these scripts, oftentimes what we are discussing is what's going on in the market and then how we have to position our listing in order to sell. Now, what you'll find, and I've been through markets that are very, very slow, but what you'll find is the seller will then come to us as we're starting to discuss what we need to do, typically with regards to a price reduction. And they're going to say such things as, can't we just do more marketing? Or what else can we do other than reduce the price in order to sell this listing? That, for me personally, was always a very, very challenging objection. And how can you possibly overcome that? Because then you feel like, hey, am I not doing enough in order to sell this listing? So that's what we are going to discuss today. Specifically, we're going to discuss how you can make your way into this conversation. And then from there, we're going to discuss this objection and how you can approach this with a seller. So let's dive in. So first thing, when we are discussing with a seller, we do need to understand how we're going to approach this conversation. Now, these conversations are not easy. However, we should not shy away from them. In fact, that is what our job is having difficult conversations at times. And there are certain things in our career, such as having challenging conversations, which aren't necessarily fun, but the more we delay them, the more challenging this is going to be. So when I'm approaching these conversations, there's two things that are going through my mind. First off, I want to be empathetic in the sense that I do need to put myself in the shoes of the seller. Now, this one's important because a seller's going through something right now. They're hearing news. They're hearing and seeing price reductions. They're seeing fewer showings. They're concerned about what the future holds. Now, for us, it might just be another listing. For them, this is their house. This is a massive asset. And so it can be very stress-inducing. So what I try to do is I try to put myself in their shoes, like literally pretend that I am a seller and that's my house. Naturally, we think, okay, well, we'll just reduce the price. However, if you're a seller and you're looking at your equity, that's a little bit of a different decision. And so our communication really needs to be very well thought out. But ultimately, the empathy is key here, is what does it feel like to be in their position right now? Now, if we just focus on the empathy side, we'll start to put ourselves in their shoes. We can even start to feel sympathetic in a sense. We kind of feel bad for them. However, we also need to be honest about what's going on. They're hiring us to actually provide them with solutions and to advise them. Now, they don't necessarily need to act on our advice. It is their decision, and I always let them know this. It's your property. It is your decision on how you want to approach this. Here is my advice, and this is why. So when I'm having a conversation with them, I'm approaching it with a level of empathy. However, I am also ensuring that I'm being honest about what is going on in the market. So how do we go about having this conversation? There's a few different ways that we can approach it. When you're having difficult conversations or when you have a seller who's extremely stressed out, when they're seeing a shifting market, what we need to do is we need to get face-to-face. I know that seems quite challenging and like that's going to be a difficult conversation to have face-to-face. The conversation is easier if it's face-to-face. Oftentimes we think an email or a phone call might be easier, when in fact it's not. It's a lot easier to do this face-to-face because empathy is a lot easier to build when you can see one another. Also, it can help with their understanding of the process. However, if we can't be face-to-face, phone call is next. We do not want to have a lot of these difficult conversations around shifting market over email. Now, of course, we do send weekly reports to sellers, but that being said, when we really start to unpack what's going on in the listing, I'm always trying to do that in person, face-to-face, or over the phone. Okay, so now that we're all set as far as empathy is concerned, we're ready to be honest and we're face-to-face with them, how do we actually break into this conversation around a shifting market? Well, it really comes down to having a conversation with them about two things. First off, it's having a conversation around controllables and uncontrollables, and then it's having a conversation around risk tolerance. So first off, when we start chatting with them, we want to have the discussion around what is uncontrollable here. There's certain things that we just can't change, and so we have to bring that up off the start. And oftentimes, the uncontrollables are what's driving the listing not selling. Not always, but usually. So those uncontrollables that we just need to have an understanding of are the market and the competition. So the market touches on what's going on in the market, which of course also relates to interest rates and then just general buyer demand. And then competition. We cannot control what the neighbor's going to list at. We can't control that we listed at 500 and then the next day we had a comparable that came on at 475. We can't control that. We have to be able to work with that. So uncontrollables, it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to try and change anything. We cannot change the market. We cannot change the competition. We need to get the uncontrollables out of the way so that we can get into the controllables. And so once we've highlighted that, we can then start to break into these controllables. Now, when it comes to these controllables, these are levers that we can all use, both agents and sellers, in order to increase the chances of selling. And so these conversations can also be had at the time of listing. However, if we're into the listing and we're trying to have a conversation with them as far as the shifting market is concerned, we need to bring these up again. So let's break into our controllables here and actually dive into them and understand how can we actually play with these. So the first one, pretty straightforward, is cleanliness, right? So if we have people coming through and they're seeing the home and it's not clean, that is something that we can control. So if we're getting feedback on that, or if we truly think that the home needs to be more clean, then we have a duty to let them know. We can offer cleaners. We can say that we've had some feedback that we may want to clean up certain rooms. And so this is the way that we can approach these sort of things. The next one is style and staging. And so is the home presented well? Is there the right style for our target buyer? Now, if the answer to that is no, we may want to have a staging consultation. We may need to stage. And so this is the next controllable concept that we can work with when it comes to a seller. The next one that we have is maintenance. And so if we're getting that feedback that maybe the home has some neglect to it and we need to work on that, that is something that we can actually control. Now, maintenance is different from renovations. And yes, renovations can be done. However, I tend to not suggest that. There's only certain cases where that would be suggested. So most of the time we're talking about general maintenance. And is there any deferred maintenance, things that they just haven't taken care of, any neglect around the property? Because that will have a huge impact, especially in a shifting market. Buyers become a lot more particular. And because of that, sellers need to be more particular with how they're presenting their home. And we've probably all been there when we're with buyers and we see a nice home and we start going through and they start adding up a list. And so I call this the red flag list. As a buyer's going through a home, they're going to start seeing red flags. After they've hit a certain number of red flags, then they're going to cross the property off. Even if the home is priced appropriately, even if it looks okay, even if, hey, it's like the right property in the right location, there's still a good chance they're not going to choose it. So if I'm going through there and I'm seeing scratches on the hardwood, I'm seeing the home needs to be painted, a cabinet's a little bit loose, and then I go downstairs and, the furnace room's really dirty. All of this is going to add up, and these are all going to be red flags. And every buyer has a certain number of red flags where once they hit that number, they're done. And they cannot actually be incentivized in many cases to come back. Once they've actually crossed off that property, oftentimes it is gone unless you do an extreme price reduction. The buyer has moved on to say, this property needs maintenance and this is not the type of property I want. So this is a very important one, and this is an important one to bring up at the time of listing as well. Next, we have showing availability. So if we're not allowing the showings, then of course, it's going to be very hard to sell. So that's the other controllable. Now, the final controllable, and this is the really important one, is price. This is something we can control. So we cannot control the market. We cannot control what the competition is doing, but we can control how we position ourselves in the market. Now, when it comes to price reductions, oftentimes when I'm having this conversation with the seller, I'm going to be empathetic and I'm going to say, oftentimes sellers feel like a price reduction is money leaving their pocket, when in fact it's not. Yes, that may be reframing your expectations, but ultimately the market's going to pay what the market's going to pay. So it's just putting us in a better position to actually get an offer and get an offer in a range that the buyers are willing to pay. When it comes to the price, I do want to be empathetic and letting them know that it feels like, because this is what it feels like for them. It feels like there's money leaving their pocket, but that's not what's happening. You're just putting a home in a better position to sell, because ultimately a list price is not what a home will sell for. A list price is marketing. And oftentimes this is confused. We think that a list price is a price on the property, when in fact it is, but that is a marketing strategy. That's why agents will underprice. That's why some sellers will overprice, because they want to add in some negotiating room. This is all a general marketing tactic. Okay, so we've discussed controllables and uncontrollables. And now typically when I'm talking about the controllables, I'm going through these and I'm saying, how are we doing in each one of these categories? Are we a 10 out of 10 in all of these categories? And then from there, I want to move into risk tolerance. Now, risk tolerance is an extremely important conversation, and it's one that most agents will miss, because oftentimes we don't have a full understanding of what level of risk a seller has. And in fact, most sellers, when they're selling their home, their risk tolerance is actually going to be low. Even somebody who thinks of themselves as, say, like a risky investor, when it comes to their own personal residence, and especially if they don't do a lot of real estate transactions, there's a very good chance that their risk tolerance will actually be lower. So I want to have a conversation with them. And I want to say, are we more risk tolerant or are we less risk tolerant? If we're more risk tolerant, then maybe we want to sit on the market at a higher price. Maybe we want to wait for that needle in the haystack buyer to come through. Or if we're more risk tolerant, maybe we want to reduce the price dramatically to try and drive multiple offers. So these are two strategies that can work well with somebody who is very risk tolerant. However, most will not be. And in fact, if you are risk tolerant, then let's play around with those two strategies. But if they say to you that they're less risk tolerant, and in fact, I don't even ask them, I just say, if you are more risk tolerant, you may be willing to stay at a higher price, or you may want to reduce dramatically in order to drive multiple offers. If you're a little less risk tolerant with this asset, then we may want to come into a range where buyers are willing to write offers. Now, there's a lot of strategy that just made its way into that conversation. First off, I'm not asking, are you risk tolerant or are you not risk tolerant? I'm not actually trying to paint a brush or get a response out of them. I'm just saying, if you are, then it may make sense to stay high. So then if they agree with that, if they say, yes, I'm risk tolerant, then they might stay high. And if they have a discussion, they say, we may not be that risk tolerant in this case, then they may want to come down into a range that can actually start to generate offers. So I just say to them, people that are risk tolerant would be willing to stay at a higher price or reduce dramatically. And those that are a little bit less risk tolerant may want to just come into that range where buyers are willing to pull the trigger. So this now leads us into the conversation. And if the seller was to say to us, well, can't we just do more marketing? Now, when this conversation is brought up, we want to be very careful. We don't want to become overly adversarial, but we do need to be honest and direct with them. So one thing that I like to do is, instead of talking about their property, I will talk about properties generally speaking. So instead of saying, this is what we need to do with your property, I'm saying generally when it comes to marketing, when we're talking about marketing a home, so I'm talking more generally about marketing versus about their home. And this then kind of helps separate this concept of me telling them the way it's going to work, and me instead kind of explaining to them, educating them on how the marketing process works. So then what I do is I get into this concept of discussing with them around the target buyer. So I say that we really need our properties to be where our target buyers are looking for properties. Now, in most cases, if not all, they're going to be looking for them online. So we need to ensure that the property is presented perfectly online. That is our main source of marketing. So once we've had that conversation, we then start to move into what marketing does do. A big portion of this is ensuring that is presented well online. That's great. What marketing is going to do is not generate offers. Marketing really doesn't generate offers, although it can to an extent. But generally speaking, what's going to actually bring offers are those controllables that we discussed. Really what we're doing is we're generating a lot of views. We're trying to get a lot of eyes on a property. And then from there, you can jump into the views. Do we have enough views? If you do not have enough views, there are a couple of things that could be at play here. First off, it could be marketing. So maybe it's not presented well online. And if that's the case, then we have to adjust that. But let's assume that it is. And the other side to it is we could just have a unique property, and it could be our buyer pool is smaller. And currently, if we're in a shifting market, buyer pools are changing and shrinking in certain cases. With that in mind, we need to understand that we have to readjust the way that we think about views. But views unto themselves do not generate offers. We have to focus more on the controllables. When we think back to the controllables, what is the biggest marketing lever that we have? It's price. Price is the biggest marketing lever. So we need to have that discussion with the seller to say, when it comes to marketing, price is truly the most important factor. Now, that being said, it does need to be presented extremely well where our buyers are looking for properties, which generally speaking is online. However, we also need to ensure that our controllables, and specifically our price, is in line with what buyers are willing to offer on. So I've discussed with them controllables and uncontrollables. I've talked about risk tolerance with them. And then I've also gone into marketing if that has came up. Then at this point in time, I want to provide a suggestion. And so I'm not saying this is what we have to do. I'm saying what I would suggest is X. I'm saying you do not have to make this decision right now. Definitely take some time to think it through. But my suggestion is X, and this is why. So if we were reducing 25,000, my suggestion is we should come down by 25,000, which would open up the market to a new buyer pool. And on top of that, we would increase our views, we would increase the number of people coming through, and hopefully generate an offer at this point in time. So I'm making a suggestion. I'm not saying you have to do this because ultimately it's their asset. And then from there, I will let them make the final decision. Now, typically when we are discussing controllables, uncontrollables, risk tolerance, and marketing, from there, we will start to have some understanding over what we need to do in order to position this property to sell. Thank you very much for watching or listening to this episode. Remember, you can reach out anytime at revrealestateschool.com, or I'm on Instagram at the.michael.montgomery. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next lesson.